Hi everyone. It's a beautiful day here in southern Indiana, and we're going to be talking about Animal Vegetable Miracle by Barbara Kingsolver. We'll talk about food anthropology, environmental science, as well as just the cultures that kind of revolve around food that Barbara Kingsolver talks about. So the vocabulary for today, we're going to talk about conspicuous consumption, which involves the economy, ethnoscience, sustainability, which again links to the economy, subsistence, and spatial analysis. I have 3 questions for you to consider while listening to this presentation and reading the book. Number 1, what makes a place attractive to make a home? Number 2, how do people live, play, and work in the spaces they create based on their local environments? And number 3, what is American food culture and is it sustainable? Also maybe, how has it changed? So a little more about Barbara Kingsolver and who she is. She's an American novelist, essayist, and poet. She was raised in rural Kentucky and lived briefly in the Congo in her early childhood. Actually, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, that image of her various books, the third book from the left is Poisonwood Bible, and she writes the story of the Congo Revolution from a four-person perspective, and it's really interesting because she comes as a missionary with her missionary father and her family, and it's fictionalized again, but based on like her experiences in the Congo, and she talks about like the life, the culture of the Congo, and how it very much differed from her own. But again, she's a fiction writer, so while it's not necessarily anthropology, she does a great job of really putting you in, or giving you a perspective rather, of the culture that is being examined. So yeah, she earned her degrees in biology from DePaul University, right here in Indiana, as well as the University of Arizona, and then she's been writing ever since. I think she published her first novel in 1988. So the Poisonwood Bible, which I briefly spoke about before, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Orange Prize, and she actually won the National Book Award of South Africa, and also the Poisonwood Bible was named an Oprah Book Club selection, which is kind of a big thing because Oprah, being as kind of famous as she is, once you're an author and you get promoted by somebody like that, your book sales are going to go up, your readership is going to go up, and so your prestige goes up. Now, with regard to the book that we are reading, Animal Vegetable Miracle, it's won numerous prizes, including the James Beard Award, which is a very prestigious writing award. And if you'd like to find out more about her, you can click on her name up at the top, and that will direct you to her website. So let's talk about home and space. If we look at the relationship between various houses and how human beings build houses, this is called spatial analysis. So if we look at the top picture on the left, we can see the first 2 images are circular. So this might tell you a lot about the beliefs and the worldviews of the human beings that are living there, right? As well, if you look at the material, the first one on the left, from the left, top left, is made out of stone, so you can say, oh, okay, this stuff is locally available, right? As well as the next image over is made out of wood, and so you would assume that, or you could deduce that the surrounding area has some sort of, mass tree growth, and that would be available to you. The house on the bottom row, like a house that we kind of assume that is what home should look like, is rectangular. And so the people here might have a very different worldview than the people at the very top. And it looks pretty permanent. Whereas if we look at the home, or summer shelter, they call it, to the right of the rectangular home, you see that it looks kind of temporary because it is a summer shelter, and you also don't want like super enclosed building structures because it's hot in the summer. So another aspect of spatial analysis, other than home construction is how the houses are related to other houses. So this can tell you a lot about the social structure of the community that you are looking at, right? So if you look at this Lua homestead, Lua people are in Southern Africa, and the Lua household, they are patriarchal and patrilineal. So the male is in the center of the homestead, and directly in back of him is the first wife, right? And then you have the second wife to the right and the third wife to the left. And these other smaller houses might be like their kitchen areas, because oftentimes they have separate sleeping areas and separate kitchens, right? And then you have the outer ring is are the sons of the man, right? And so when he maybe establishes his own homestead, or he becomes a headman or a chief, he will set up a similar homestead. And so this keeps the women, the wives, kind of protected by the mature sons. So depending on where you live, and how you set up your home is it's very important, and it's very culturally based. So with regard to Kingsolver's book, the reason that she moves, or that she wants to move from Tucson, Arizona, is because she feels like she wants to be more sustainable. One of the reasons why she moved there in the first place was because of opportunity, right? So what types of resources? And in today's world, in our post-industrial world, we look at resources as being jobs, right? We're not necessarily looking at like, hey, is there firewood that I can procure? So one of her reasons for moving to Arizona was she, had a job. With regard to her moving to Appalachia, she was also rooted in the area. She mentions in the very beginning of the book, when she was in Arizona, she never met anyone that had her surname. They didn't share that connectedness. And then moving to this area in Appalachia and Virginia, she could open up the telephone book and see a whole bunch of kin, right? So that's another reason why people either move to certain places, or they decide to go visit, right? It can also be one of the reasons that people move away, right? Depending on what your kin relationship is. Yeah. So moving on to economy, which Kingsolver does a great job, I feel like, of talking about the economy. But this is a very critical examination of capitalism, right? But there's many different types of economy. So first off, we have the subsistence economy, which is basically hunting and gathering, working through local trade networks, and there's gift exchange, so gift giving and gift taking, and then what that means with the relationship. And so maybe in some cultures, if you give a gift that is bigger than one that you've given, that means you might have to like up them, right? Some cultures, like in the United States, when we give a gift, oftentimes, like if you see the price tag here, it says $3. Let's say I was giving this as a gift. I would take this price tag off because I wouldn't want the person to know how much I got it for. And actually, if you look, if you see, it says like $14.95, that's how much it was. So maybe I want the person to assume like, hey, I gave them a really expensive book. Or it's also saying to people like, price isn't necessarily the most important thing about the gift. The use of the gift might be the most important thing, right? In other cultures, like in Japan, people actually leave the price tags on so that you can see how much money and how much of your resources you spent on them. And that determines, like their relationship, right? Or the status of the gift giver. It actually also establishes the status of the gift receiver. And if you remember back to Ruth Benedict in the Inuit culture, the Kwakiutl, she talked about their potlatch ceremonies. So if one person gave, like 50 canoes, they brought them to a potlatch. The receiving end would have to either meet that same level of gifting or they would have to exceed it, right? So gift giving can be very political. I know also in China, because I studied in China for a little bit, to give a person a clock or a watch was really bad luck because that signified like, hey, your time is up, right? So that was bad luck. So gift giving and reciprocation are very important things within a culture that relate directly to economy, right? Market exchange is based on producer and a consumer. Usually mass production within an industrialized society, you have factories, right, and goods. You have very, very specialized people. This is not to say that pre-industrialization, like before there were factories, there were no producers and consumers, because as people and populations grew and societies became more interconnected and more complex, you had skills, right? People who had a skill set to maybe make combs, other skill sets for people who could write, other skill sets were people who could build buildings, right? Others there were people could cook and clean. So really, once you have those specializations, then not everybody can do everything. So you need to you need to belong to a market economy, right? Industrialization is just one form, and it's the form that we happen to partake in. Now, the United States is considered a post-industrial economy. So post-industrial is that like we don't have many factories, which you might realize. And instead of focusing on making things, we focus on a service and knowledge economy. So, like when you do your first job, instead of like going to work at a factory and producing actual things, tangible things, you instead go and get a job at McDonald's or a job like as a bartender or maybe not a bartender, but like a waitress or a waiter. And then from there, you continue your schooling so that you can get other types of service jobs. Maybe you want to become a doctor. Maybe you want to become a nurse or like an engineer, right? Those are things, services, right, that you would provide for people. Or maybe you want to become a professor, and so you like spread knowledge. Also, market economy has a wider range of trade networks. And so when you look at the United States, which is post-industrial, and then like China, which is industrial and post-industrial as well, they're kind of mixed economies, right? They're both actually mixed economies, but they belong to this global network, right? Where human beings, where it's actually based on multinational corporations rather than just, like cottage economies where people work from the home and then they go to a market and they sell their stuff, right? Now, so within all these cultures, you have conspicuous consumption. And conspicuous consumption is basically showing off that you were able to consume a certain product. Now, within our own American economy, let's say going to a certain store, purchasing something and holding the bag, right? Holding the bag and it says like Macy's or Gucci, right? Those are things where it shows that you have a lot of money or that you have a certain amount of money. Driving a Corvette, right? Or driving some sort of Land Rover, let's say. That means, or let's say a McLaren even, I don't know, McLarens are like $100,000 cars. That shows your status and your wealth, right? Wearing, like I'm wearing Africa, right, on my shirt. So showing that, like, this is something that's important to me, right? People wear t-shirts with, logos on them, with, like sayings. And so this shows your conspicuous consumption, your status, what you believe in, your things that you're interested in, right? And all this revolves around the economy, right? So with regard to the economy, it definitely affects the environment because it determines what you can produce and what you can consume. Environmental anthropology is looking at how human beings interact with the environment. And one of the things that Kingsolver does is look at sustainability. And sustainability with regard to food, especially. Sustainability, as defined by dictionary.com, is the ability to be sustained, supported, upheld, or confirmed. Number two, it's environmental science, which is the quality of not being harmful to the environment or depleting natural resources, and thereby supporting long-term ecological balance. So she looks at, she mentions the hungry world on page 18 and 19, and examines industrial farming, that people who are involved in industrial farming argue that having these large agricultural kind of factories allows people to be fed, like bigger populations, which she kind of takes issue with, because she says that the effect of monocropping, cash crops like corn, soybeans, maybe tobacco, coffee, the effects of those cash crops on the land, climate, and animals is very detrimental, because with monocropping, you need, if one disease or one sort of pest comes and attacks your crop, everything's gone because you only have one crop. So she discusses this. She discusses the nutritional value and how it's lessened with monocropping, and how it just affects human beings, right? She also talks about the processing, packaging, and shipping of food in the industrial model of producing food. One of the things that, since it's almost Halloween, I thought would be interesting was to look at pumpkins. If you go around recently, you might have seen that there's people, and you might have done it yourself. People are are carving jack-o'-lanterns, and there's pumpkins out on their stoops. Now, what happens like after like a couple days after Halloween? Well, or a couple weeks. Those pumpkins are either thrown away in the trash or they are left there to rot, and then they're thrown in the garbage, and the garbage goes to a landfill. So if you look at these two articles down here at the bottom, you'll see that this is a terrible waste, not only of pumpkins and food that they could be used for, but it's also a waste of the natural resources that it took to produce those pumpkins. The land, the water, it's the fertilizer. It's also a waste of the petroleum that it took to bring those pumpkins to the market, right? And the petroleum that you used to go in your car and purchase the pumpkins, it's also a waste of your money that you worked hard for. And so what does this say about our culture, right? And what does this say about our values as Americans, where we practice a custom that is really not beneficial to anyone. It's just kind of like, yay, we're doing it, it's fun. So looking at food anthropology, intimately connected with environmental anthropology, which is why I decided to pick Kingsolver's book for everybody to read, is that it's a subdiscipline of anthropology which connects an ethnographic and historical perspective with contemporary social issues. Food anthropology examines not only food production and consumption systems, but it looks at the values that we have around food, the aesthetics, right? And on page 15, Kingsolver talks about how different ethnic groups have their specific food. And she asks the questions, well, what is America's food culture and is it sustainable? And she mentions on page 16, food culture in the United States has long been cast as property of a privileged class. It is nothing of the kind. Culture is the property of a species, and human beings are a particular species. So we all have culture. We all have a food culture. And to say it is of one class or another is actually very mistaken. So she's trying to figure out what about our culture, our food culture, is making us live these unsustainable ways, and what is it going to take to bring us back to more sustainable ways of living? And how will that affect our inner relationships with human beings, with each other? So looking at ethnoscience, ethnoscience was developed in the 1960s, and it was an approach to indigenous knowledge systems. The formal methods of analysis can be applied on various domains, such as kinship terms, flora, fauna, color, diseases. Some of these images are like the top left image shows, some white guys looking at some items with some native peoples. They're exchanging their knowledge systems. So going clockwise, you have the yogic or Ayurvedic energy systems, which they're called chakras. And this is a way of classifying energy systems within the human body in Ayurvedic, which is a South Indian medical system. Below that is Chinese medicine. So Chinese have thousands of years of practicing and collecting medicines, looking at animal parts as well as plant parts and combining them together to treat diseases. And then finally, the bottom left is a muti shop in South Africa, which you can see these all over in small towns and big cities all over South Africa. And this is, again, very similar to the traditional Chinese medicines, where they have animal parts and plant parts and powders and leaves and various things to treat your spirit, your body, and your mind. So there's many things that you can study in ethnoscience, and this is like a subdiscipline of anthropology. One observation that came out of ethnoscience was that while the content of cultural categories was plastic, arbitrary, and highly variable, that variability was itself both ordered and constrained by, among other things, the physiological means of perception. This is from your text, Morgan and Just, on page 41 and 42. And in this, it's kind of showing you that there is no one right way of science. Different cultures actually have their different ways of classifying the world and understanding it. And so ethnobotany, which is a subdiscipline of ethnoscience itself, is merely the study of a region's plants and their practical uses through traditional knowledge of local culture and people, which is kind of what Kingsolver is trying to go back to. Now, it might not be, when she goes to Appalachia, it might not necessarily be the indigenous people that she's talking to, but the settlers have been in this country in Appalachia for hundreds of years at that point. And so they have collected knowledge and ethnobotany, folk medicines, which are actually based on like observed sciences. So one of the important points that Kingsolver talks about is cycles, and she examines our culture and the difference between the past and the present. So in the past, people needed to wait, right? Versus in the current culture, we have instant gratification because of all the technology that we have at our disposal in the United States. So with regard to waiting, she talks about farmers markets, the seasonal vegetables and products that come to farmers markets, such as asparagus, morel mushrooms, ginseng, which is part of the kind of hunting or gathering um, culture, as well as tobacco. All of these things are seasonal, right? Farmers markets are also local. Ideally, they're local. And in these ways of waiting for things, you have community building because you have a direct relationship between the consumer and the producer. Whereas when you shop at a supermarket, food equals commodities, right? Food is not necessarily something that you prided yourself in, like, hey, look at this great tomato that I've grown. It's more like, hey, how much money can I get for this tomato, right? So there becomes a disconnect between the food and the people. It's actually a dehumanizing process because you no longer have the consumer and the producer meeting on equal grounds. You actually have like this middleman where you have no idea who has grown this product, what things have gone into it, what energy, what fertilizers, what type of nutrition is it coming from. Whereas when you look at farmers markets, it's a very different culture, right? Um, and so one might cost more, so the farmer's market, but it's quality versus quantity. Whereas in the supermarket, it might be cheap, but here it's quantity versus quality. And in the United States, which is becoming a global phenomena, we have moved into the realm that the idea of bigger is better, right? And I really urge you to watch Vedanta Shiva, who is mentioned by Kingsolver. She's a nuclear physicist as well as a quantum physicist, and she talks about food production and various transnational, multinational businesses like Monsanto, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and how they affect not only our food, but our ways of thinking about life in general. And then if you'd like, here are a couple of infographics that kind of show, the two different cultures. One which is very instant gratification, and the other one which is again like waiting and being patient. And that's, of course, revolving around farming. Another thing that Kingsolver talks about is foraging. Foraging is the acquisition of food by hunting, fishing, or gathering of plant matter. It is an adjective, according to dictionary.com. It's also characterized by or dependent upon the acquisition of food by such means as food gathering. So on the top, you have fiddleheads, which are all around in Indiana in the forests. They're basically the ferns um, before they've like fully unraveled. They look like fiddleheads and they taste kind of like asparagus. They're very tasty. You can just go out into the forest and cut them. They're free. It's just a matter of how much time you spend collecting them, and they're fairly easy to spot. Um, Morel mushrooms, which again are in this Indiana region. It's more like hunting them. Um, People really pride themselves over hunting, and these are things that Kingsolver talked about, right? People pride themselves on like finding the biggest morel or just finding morels at all because they kind of people kind of anthropomorphize them and say they hide. Um, but it really takes a keen eye, and they're very much a part of a specific culture. I'd never heard of morel mushrooms until I came to Indiana, coming from New York City. And then you also have a different type of forager, right? So the urban forager, if you will, which is dumpster divers, right? They're also foragers, but instead of going into the forests, they're going into, dumpsters, and they're getting a lot of food. So this guy is actually showing you how much supermarkets throw away, how unsustainable it is, and how much you can actually get for free if you just, kind of change your mindset and you change the way you live in society and kind of change your culture, right? So going back almost to hunter-gatherer, but not necessarily having to live, in tiny communities. You can still live in the city and be a hunter-gatherer. So in conclusion, um, I chose this book, Animal Vegetable Miracle, because it's a really interesting look at two different types of culture. So the homesteader culture, which Kingsolver was trying to go towards, more sustainable, more community-based, and the industrial complex, the industrial society, right, or post-industrial society, um, where there's global connections, but there's not necessarily those inner connectedness between the human beings. So food production and consumption really varies throughout the United States. And in studying the anthropology of food, it can tell us a lot about the economy, our relationships, and our worldviews. Examining anthropology of food can also show us how culture, economy, resources, relationships, and values change throughout history. And we can also see how we are benefiting and hurting our lives based on the ways we decide to live that might not be the most sustainable. And we can also find ways where we can reclaim some more beneficial, healthy aspects of the way we've once lived and kind of bring them back into our present day life. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day.